Russia and Ukraine. It's hosted by the Atlantic Council. Live coverage on C-SPAN.
In Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. This is a super important event. Today's webinar is called Fighting to Survive: The Human Toll of the Kremlin's Ukraine War. We're joined by four fantastic experts, and it's my pleasure to introduce them now. We have Dr. Hori Namiria, and he's a member of parliament and someone who's been focused on this issue for many, many years. Welcome, Hori. Glad to have you here. I also have Sasha Galkin. He's the director of Right to Protection. It's a really important NGO that works in the Donbass, and I'm so pleased to be a member of his board. I have Michael Basikaru, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Eurasia Center and all over C-SPAN, all over CNN, all over Canadian media, and he is the former OSCE SMM spokesman, so you've probably seen him on TV before. Michael, it's great to have you on our platform. And last but not least, I have Maria Tomek, who's a great activist, but now she is the head of the National Office of the Crimea Platform. Maria, glad to have you here. So, as you know, Ukraine is in the news in a major way, and it looks like Ukraine is going to be invaded by Russia very, very soon. We very much hope and pray that that doesn't happen, but we need to be prepared. There are 1.5 million internally displaced persons in Ukraine right now. 1.5 million people, and there will be far, far more. There will be a major refugee crisis in Ukraine and in Europe if Vladimir Putin invades. So we want to dive into this. We want to talk about the current situation and what happens if he does indeed invade. So I want to go to Michael Basikaru first. Hey, Michael, let's start at the beginning. So this isn't Vladimir Putin's first rodeo in Ukraine. Remind us, what did he do in 2014 and what were the humanitarian consequences?
Thanks for having me, Melinda. Good to be with you and honored to be here. My first Atlantic Council event as a senior fellow, so I'm humbled. So yeah, listen, it's important to point out that before 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea, and then they invaded the Donbass, which is currently occupied since 2014, Ukraine had no internally displaced people. And now, as you mentioned, it has a million plus, some even say 2 million plus. Numbers are hard to come by. Also, at that time, before the 2014 actions of Mr. Putin, Ukraine did not rely on external food aid. And after that invasion, things got very bad, especially in the occupied Donbass area. So entities like the World Food Program really stepped up their activities, their interventions. So things turned very, very bad. A big problem, of course, I know this from being in the occupied territories many times as part of the OSCE monitoring mission, is that it's now very, very heavily bombed out. But at least in the early phase of the occupation, there was a lot more traffic back and forth between the occupied territories over that so-called line of contact, which is turned into a pretty hard border-like line right now, to the government-controlled areas. And why is that important? It's because a lot of, especially pensioners in the occupied territories, crossed over to government-controlled areas to get their pensions, to do shopping, to meet with relatives, that sort of thing. Now that flow has been reduced to almost a trickle. So the hardship has been even more compounded. One other quick thing, and this, I got to say, having worked for UNICEF for so long and having served in areas like the occupied Palestinian territory and also in areas like Afghanistan, is that front line, which is several hundred kilometers wide. It divides occupied Donbass with non-occupied areas. That, according to UNICEF 2 years ago, is one of the most mined areas of the world, landmines. These are a huge, huge threat, especially, of course, to children, and then also, to agriculture, things like that. We've also, as far back as 2014, 2015, we observed ourselves evidence of cluster bombs. We couldn't say at the time which side were using these banned weapons, but whoever laid them there, they know who they are. But these are also a huge, huge threat to children because many of them look like little toys. They pick them up and with devastating consequences. Just quickly, where are we now? Well, like I said, the flow of humanity across that contact line is very little, but also has to be said that the humanitarian situation spreads way, way beyond the occupied areas to other parts of Ukraine. And right now, I thought I'd introduce this into the conversation, is there's a huge silent killer pummeling Ukraine, and that is the COVID-19 Omicron wave. It's really sickened a lot of people here. I just checked the Johns Hopkins figures yesterday, and Ukraine is now in the top 15 countries in the world with the highest 28-day death count. The other thing that's happening, just to wrap up, a lot of heads of missions, international NGOs and others are getting sickened here by COVID. I know of at least 2 UN heads of agencies that are down with COVID, as well as large numbers of their teams. Why is that important? Is because, well, these are the very people we're relying on as well to do interventions at this critical time in Ukraine's modern history, to deliver that aid, to plan ahead if and when there is an invasion. So that is something Ukraine does not need right now. We can't just really blame it on anybody, but it needs to be said that Ukraine was quite late to stepping up to the plate in terms of preventing COVID, like getting vaccines. And the other thing here is vaccination rates are abysmally low, under 40%, and adherence to global public health protocols is very low. So we're hoping for the best, of course.
Yeah, and let's hope that these organizations are able to staff up and bring other people in and people recover quickly. But that's an important point. Thanks so much. Sasha, what's at stake if Vladimir Putin invades again? Will we have an enormous refugee crisis? And where do you think people will go?
I think, yes, it's kind of, it's very, if it would happen, and it would be an escalation, and it could be different scenarios for this escalation, and it could be something along the contact line, and then it would be an additional, maybe up to 200,000 newly displaced persons, and of course they would try to seek some safe places in the adjacent regions like Zaporizhia, Dnipro, or Kharkiv, and maybe Kiev. So we encountered with this situation 8 years ago. At that time, it was a huge wave of displaced people from Donbass and from Crimea. And if this scenario is one of the scenarios, it would be kind of a mild scenario. So that would be, as I said, it's about 200,000 people. And then if it would be more, let's say, severe, and let's say that the non-government controlled territory becomes Donetsk and Lugansk regions large, so then we might have kind of almost 2 million new displaced people on top of those who have already fled 8 and 7 years ago. So,
Sasha, what happens though if Vladimir Putin does a land invasion and he goes from Kharkiv to Kiev to Dnipro to Odessa and he tries to take everything east? How many millions of displaced people are we talking about? Are we talking about 10, 8, 6?
It's very hard to say. So even just as far as I know, nobody even considers this scenario seriously so far. But yes, it would be up to 2 million, I believe. And of course, Ukraine would be a great generator for refugees, those who would be heading westwards. And what I've heard, some experts estimate this refugee wave also about from 2 up to 3 million people.
Wow, that really puts things in perspective.
And I think this would be the biggest maybe refugee crisis since Balkans.
For sure. And do you expect those refugees to try to seek safety in Poland or somewhere else?
Of course, the closest countries, of course, Poland and Slovakia.
Yeah.
And of course, some of them would try, and because a lot of, specifically those who reside in the western parts, and if it will not be, of course, invaded. So in this case, so people would try just to move to these regions, but this region is also quite small compared to the central part and the western part. I mean, population-wise and sometimes place-wise, it's not a lot of big cities. So and many people have already relatives and friends, those who live in Poland, those who live in Slovakia, and they will try to join them there. Hard to say what would happen along the border, international borders then. But I think that Poland and the adjacent countries would start preparing for that as well.
Yeah, and I hope they are now. Thanks so much for those insights. Dr. Nemiria, question for you. What can be done to convince Vladimir Putin to de-escalate now?
Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer. But at the same time, I also think that we should be sober-minded, and the first thing to avoid panicking. So what you described in your introductory remarks, for me, is a worst-case scenario.
Yep.
But this is precisely where Putin is skilled at, that he considers multiple scenarios, and some of them might be overlapping with others. The point just been discussed about the wave of migrants, unthinkable before, is a kind of threat that exists if this worst case scenario would erupt. I would like to mention that we should remember not just of the 1.5 million displaced persons, internal refugees basically, but also of more than 14,000 now killed Ukrainians, and almost 40,000 who were wounded. That's already at their toll. So what first thing to convince Putin to de-escalate, we should always remember that our foreign and security policy starts at home. So this is the point of departure. What does it mean in practical sense? It means that we should stay firm and united. Firm and united. Also, it means that we should keep up all the steps that are deterring Putin from invading, including two most important things: strengthening both our army, but also sanctions. And this is where external actors are of value. Second, and I think it is important to understand that what we are having now is not a Ukraine crisis, as it frequently referred to or called by media. It is a crisis of European security and post-Cold War security order. And war in Donbass and the threat of escalation is only the most visible part of this crisis of the post-Cold War European security order. So that means that we cannot it would be wrong to try to solve the problem in Donbass on a bilateral, as a Russian-Ukrainian armed conflict, or trying to use what is definitely almost in a dead end, so namely the Minsk process, which already tomorrow, by the way, will be 7 years exactly when the Minsk II has been signed. And in the course of this year, it didn't bring us any significant, not a single point. So the 13 points of Minsk II has not been implemented. So therefore, I think it is important, remember, and the history teaches us, I'm a historian by education, that at the time of great threats to the country, usually they form the national unity governments. I think this is priority number one for all Ukrainians, to start in practical sense to unite themselves, not by words, but by deeds.
I like so many of those points that you just made, Dr. Nemiria, but I need to dig in a little bit. I just got back from Kiev and I came away with two observations. The first one is that the Ukrainians are not ready at all. I understand that you got to keep people calm, but the border between Russia and Ukraine is very long, it's very porous, and it's not well defended. When are you guys going to get your act together and harden that border? And when is the president, you're a member of a very important opposition party, and there doesn't seem to be political unity at the highest level. When is the president going to call everyone together and say, let's work together and stop fighting? Is that going to happen anytime soon?
I think this is responsibility of the president, who was elected and the mandate to bring peace to the country, to start doing this. And this is what the opposition, we as opposition, calling to the president and also requesting to start formal consultations to form a national unity government. Because this is one of the things that will send as strongest possible signal to Putin, who considers Ukraine as not a country or a failed state. So, and we should not give him a chance to prove his sick idea that Ukraine is not a country. It is a country, it is independent, a proud country, and now time for politicians to prove it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if Volodymyr Zelensky calls you and Ms. Tymoshenko and says, please come, we want to form a unity government, are you guys in?
We already called Volodymyr Zelensky to start doing this. We're now expecting a return call. And usually it should be a kind of mutual effort. We are ready, we signaled this. And it's not the question of which position in this united government, which politician will take. It will come next. But first is a goodwill, strong will, and strong signals to Ukrainians who deserves their politicians to behave in a responsible manner, but also to Putin and his people in the Kremlin, who consider Ukraine is too fragile, too disorganized, too chaotic, and this is the most demoralizing thing that could happen. But also, it is important for our partners to take seriously Ukrainian concerns. And to take seriously Ukrainian concerns means to be in close coordination with the Ukrainians, because sometimes there is a feeling that when Ukraine is not at the table, it could be on the menu. So this is the important thing, to avoid a perception of such that exists in Ukraine, frankly, that something is going on behind the Ukrainian back, and something is going to be decided without Ukraine being consulted or asked to participate.
That's a very important point. You forgot one thing. I would say that you need a unity government to reassure the Europeans. It's really, really important. We need the Europeans to maintain their unity, especially on sanctions. So I hear you and I second you. You ignored my first question, though. When is Ukraine going to harden the border? I know it's not up to you, but have you guys talked to Zelensky and said we're really worried about this? Make it happen.
Yeah, we're talking to military experts, and those who are following clearly understands the weakest and the most fragile points in the Ukrainian defense. It's namely that we are basically disarmed, or very disarmed, and we don't have any reliable now anti-aircraft or anti-ship ammunition and weaponry to protect our seashore and the Black Sea and the Azov Sea, or in a case of the full-blown attack using the airplanes. And this is very important now to remind in terms of what kind of weaponry Ukraine urgently needs to minimize, or at least to decrease, the risk that it's going to be disarmed almost naked in front of this worst-case scenario of the full-scale military aggression. And it's also timely to remind Americans, as we are talking to the addressing American audience, that in the 1994, Ukraine gave up third largest nuclear arsenal that it possessed after the breakup of the Soviet Union, 2,000 strategic nuclear warheads, 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and 44 strategic bombers that were supposed to target American cities and American territories. So that's why it is important that the guarantees or assurances that were given to Ukraine, they're delivered at the time of the most serious crisis that we are facing now since independence.
Dr. Nemiri, I promise I won't keep grilling you, but I have one other question. We are talking to so many Americans with this podcast, and we're delighted to have that opportunity. Why does Ukraine matter to Americans? So many of the viewers here, live in Minnesota or Seattle or Omaha. Ukraine is really far away. We got a lot of problems here. I think you know that. COVID is still out of control. Our economy is not very good. And we have intense political polarization. Ukraine seems like a pretty small issue. What's your response to that?
I already provided one, and I believe serious argument. It's not a peripheral problem on the outskirts of Europe, far away from the United States. I provided an example that Ukraine is a country who gave up third largest nuclear arsenal, more than combined nuclear arsenals at that time of the Great Britain, France, and China. And that was not just the weaponry, they were targeting the American cities. Now, the second question related to it, when now the United States and American citizens are very much concerned of the threat that is palpable from Iran, that is going to, or desperate to acquire nukes, or the South Korea, it is important as a precedent, if country as Ukraine, who gave up nuclear weapon peacefully in exchange of the security guarantees should come when they are needed. So if not, then of course that would create a very sad precedent. But also I would like to mention second point in this sense, that when Putin will be allowed to forcefully change the border and conquer the country, peaceful, democratic, free-loving country, independent country, that would mean that nobody is going to be secure. And the history also teaches us that when on the eve of the Second World War, there were some appeasers who thought that let's give to Germany, Hitler Germany, Czechoslovakia, Sudetian, or then give him Poland, and we will be safe. No, that's not the case. Therefore, I believe it is innate self-interest of the United States and the citizens of the United States to make sure that protection of independent and free-loving people is something that's not for pompous speeches in the international conferences, but something that is delivered in a very, very American manner, timely, full force, and credible.
I wish you were a politician in America, Rory. That was beautiful. I think I would even phrase it more directly than the way you did. If Putin wins in Ukraine, he will not be satisfied, and he will come after the Baltic states and Poland next. So America cares about European security, and Putin is not going to be satisfied. That's why this matters to Americans all over the country. And Americans also believe in freedom, and Ukrainians have fought long and hard to have that freedom realized and to live a life of dignity. That's how I would answer it. But I'll put my moderator hat back on and stop being a panelist. I want to bring my wonderful friend Maria into this conversation. Maria, we've talked a lot about the Donbass, and unfortunately, Crimea doesn't get any attention. Remind us what happened to Crimea in 2014, and what's the state of play there? What is life like now for people who live in Crimea? How many Ukrainians are there? How many Russian security services people are there? Is it a nice place? It used to be a place where people would vacation. What's it like now?
Hello, indeed. Thank you so much for bringing the Crimean issue to this whole discussion, whole debate, because you're right that recently this issue was kind of on the margins of the discussions as most of the attention comes to the eastern Ukraine. However, I have to say that, of course, this military buildup that happens all over Ukraine in the northern part and eastern part is also presented in the Russian-occupied Crimea, as we see that the number of military contingent is growing up as well there, and military exercises are going on there. So if we go back to the year 2014, we can say that it's all started with the occupation of Crimea. So Russia occupied Crimea in the end February 2014, and then they proceeded with invasion in the eastern Ukraine. And since then, of course, the Crimea is considered to be an occupied territory, temporarily occupied territory by Ukraine, but what's more important, by the major international players, and in particular by the UN GA, the UN General Assembly adopts annually resolutions regarding the human rights situation in Crimea, and also, which is important in the context of the present situation, on the militarization of Crimea. And I would like just to emphasize these two important processes, that the situation with human rights, will go into details deeply, but it's getting worse and worse. And if you look at the resolutions of the UNGA, you can see that literally all of the basic fundamental human rights are being violated in Crimea, starting from the right to life and up to the right to property. Now it's endangered as well, of course, and that caused a huge flow, not so huge as in the eastern Ukraine, but still people fled from Crimea to mainland of Ukraine, but also to other countries, but mainly to mainland of Ukraine. And speaking about figures, until now it's estimated by the Ukrainian official, by the government, to be about 52,000 IDPs, from Crimea that fled the territory, temporarily occupied territory in Crimea and moved to mainland Ukraine. But that's not the final, so to say, number, because these are those people who registered themselves as IDPs, but more, at least two times more people actually moved. And these are people, of course, in particular, those who are endangered in Crimea, Crimean Tatar community that are recognized as indigenous population of Crimea, but also Ukrainians. And it's not so much dependent on the ethnical background, but it's more related to whether this person has pro-Ukrainian views, whether this person supports Ukrainian territorial integrity, or this person does not support. And just to bring a very clear and important example is that one of the most prominent political prisoners in Crimea, Oleg Sentsov, who is a film director, currently he is released, and luckily, so he is Russian. His ethnicity background is Russian, and he has even Russian surname, like Sentsov, very Russian surname, but still he was persecuted because he was on these pro-Ukrainian positions. And I would just like briefly maybe to react to some things that you were discussing before that. And I would like just to say that, okay, so I'm sorry, I can't hear you. So can I continue? Okay, so I will wrap up here.
Maria, sorry, that was perfect. That was absolutely enough detail. We know Sentsov well. He's been on our platform, and that's a great point. I think that if you want to say one point about the human rights situation specifically in Crimea, that would be helpful. I did a bunch of research on this a few years ago, and I was shocked to find out that children are expected to report on their parents. That Crimea has become an absolute police state. Do you want to say anything about the human rights situation in Crimea? I don't think most Americans know that.
Yes, just the general thing. I think that the most important thing to know about human rights in Crimea is that all of the restrictive and repressive policies that Russia is using, because we all understand that Russia itself is a kind of police state. But when it comes to the Russian occupied territories, it becomes even worse, because something that they are trying to do in the occupied territories, then they implement in their kind of, in their main, so to say, territory. And first of all, I would like to mention political persecution, which is very clear. And currently we have at least 120 people, those who are persecuted for political motives in Crimea. And most of these people are Crimean Tatars. And just on this week, we had 4 more people arrested. Those people who are activists, who are reporting about human rights violations. And I would like to say that indeed, we still have people inside Crimea who are brave enough to report about situation with human rights and with supporting like families of political prisoners, etc., etc. And all of these repressive, restrictive politics are aimed at the goal of the colonization of Crimea. And again, it's not some political statement from my side. It's something that was already mentioned in the resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly. These policies that are aimed aimed at, so to say, clearing up the territory, like removing all of the pro-Ukrainian people, those who does not support the colonizing authorities, occupying authorities. And there is a parallel process when Russian Federation is bringing people, transferring people from the Russian Federation to Crimea. And it's really hard to estimate now the numbers, the figures of that process, but according to general estimations, it's at least 200,000 people that were brought, like servicemen, policemen, Federal Security Service, but also like civilians who are brought via various incentives related to, so to say, different governmental programs that are aimed at making people move to Crimea from the Russian Federation. So we have this like classical process of colonization in the post-colonial times, and it's clear in Crimea, but also this militarization process, which also touches upon children, because children are forced to participate in various like patriotic camps, military patriotic camps. And of course, it's the militarization of this public space, because hate speech is being used very extensively. And all those things related to this victory, so to say, cult within Russian Federation, and now it's been expanded to the occupied territories as well. So therefore, it would not be excessive to say that Crimea is turned into a military base, and it's not happened like yesterday. It's a process that was ongoing like throughout all these years.
Thanks, Maria. That's super helpful, and I'd love to do more on that. I'd love to have you write for us about that process as well. There's been some really important work that Chatham House did. Arisia Lusevich wrote some really important articles about that process. I really recommend them if you're interested. Thanks so much. I'm so glad you were able to join us. Sasha, I'd like to bring you back in the conversation. You have offices in the Donbass, and you're keeping your eye closely on the situation. So first of all, the greatest humanitarian needs in Ukraine have always been along the line of contact that Michael described, and there are often shortages of running water and not enough food. Could you paint a picture of what life is like for us? Who lives across that contact line, and what's their daily life like? And you're muted, Sasha.
I was thinking actually this way. Okay. Thank you very much for the question. And yes, indeed, we are present in the eastern Ukraine, and we have offices very close to the contact line. And every day, our staff actually encounter people very close to this, those who live there. And I think that the stories of real people actually who are forced to survive, literally survive, is in these extremely difficult conditions. So they speak better about the state of affairs. It's been quite a recent story about this is a very small village in the Donetsk region. So it's very close to the line contact. So, and it's in 2014 and 15, it has lost 90% of its population. And now there are still about 20 people left there who survive without electricity and water supply. And one of them is a 40 years old Alessia and her son, 11-year-old son. And she doesn't have a steady income, and she's unable to find work because her health, especially her mental health, and that has significantly deteriorated since the beginning of the conflict. And she, like most of those who live in this small village, which is called Taramchuk, survives with the help of humanitarian organizations, actually. And the family house was damaged several times during the shelling of the village and needs to be repaired. But she cannot receive compensation, government compensation, from because the house has not been completely destroyed. It's a little bit ridiculous situation. And I would say this is one of the numerous examples. And 14 of the 75 amalgamated communities formed in Donetsk and Lugansk regions during the decentralization reform, they are along the contact line, and some of the settlements are completely or partially isolated, and they do not have transport connection, medical facilities, they are literally cut off from civilization. And it's quite uncommon for us that when the ambulance could not reach the patient. And for instance, after a shelling of Novoselovka, it's Vtoraya, it's a very small village also in Donetsk government-controlled territories. It happened last summer, and 2 local residents were wounded actually, and the man died, and the woman needed emergency medical care, but the ambulance could not arrive. And the woman was rescued by just military doctors there. So there is another view. Those who live on the other side of the contact line, non-government controlled territories, areas. And on top of all this, almost all these issues I have actually just depicted, they have to cross the contact line. And the problem is that it used to be 5 checkpoints along the contact line in Donetsk and Lugansk regions. And since COVID started, 3 of them were closed from the side of the de facto authorities. And there are only 2 checkpoints now in Lugansk and Donetsk regions, those available for crossing. And the people have to overcome long distances and spend large sums now on the road. Like another example, if I have time, I don't know, do I have?
Yeah. And Alex, or Sasha, can you tell people who are listening where they can read about these stories of people? And can you also give us a clue? So I think Americans do want to help. We do care about what's happening, especially to elderly people in the Donbass. Is there a place where we can go online and give money and the money will actually go to elderly people to buy food and water and medical supplies?
We are, as an organization, do not collect this money. Particularly, we are thinking about that through our American counterpart to collect this some assistance for these elderly people. But I think that Peace Corps and UN organizations actually can actually do that.
Okay. Tell us one more story, and then I want to bring Michael in for a conversation about the international donor community.
It's about crossing the contact line and, from the non-government controlled territory. And I personally met this woman. This is 70 years old, Lydia, and she lives now in Donetsk. This is non-government controlled territory. This is a big city, 1 million population. So, and she traveled to Zaporizhia. It's about 300 kilometers from there. And in order to receive her pension, because she's a Ukrainian and she's entitled to get her pension, but she cannot get this pension in the non-government controlled territory. So she was supposed to travel to the government controlled territory. So, and when she was on her way back to Donetsk and successfully crossed the contact line at the checkpoints on the government-controlled territories, she was actually not allowed, detained at the other part and at the other side of the checkpoints on the non-government-controlled territory, because the woman, she's old and she forgot actually to submit a request for entrance with the de facto authorities. And before she traveled to Zaporizhia from Donetsk, 300 kilometers, she traveled through Russian Federation because it was easier for her, and it is more than 1,000 kilometers. And due to stress, and she had a panic attack, and she really needed help. And our staff actually at the checkpoint helped Lydia to get in contact with her sister and brought her for temporary observation to the close village, where her sister came later to pick up her. And we constantly observe these numerous cases where people cannot cross over the contact line, especially the elderly. They cannot draw up documents on their own, do not have money for travel. They experience health issues on their way to the GCA and back. So it's a massive problem now. And specifically, like some figures, if you don't mind. For instance, the flow of crossing continued to decline in the last year, sorry. For instance, in 2019, before COVID, there were 16.5 million crossings a year through these 5 checkpoints. In 2020, with COVID, it dropped to 3.5 million crossings. And last year, it was only 1,300,000 crossings. It's a clear sign of these problems on the checkpoints and the inability people actually to
move. Yeah,
to move,
that's a really
to see their relatives, to get this money, and specifically elderly people. For them, it's even more expensive to travel than the money they actually have to pay for traveling. It's may exceed their pension for months.
So, Sasha, next time we do this, we'll show pictures of the crossing in Stansia, Luhansk. I think that people should be shocked to see what it's like. So there's two.
It's really heartbreaking. It's I just was there.
So for those of you who don't know, who are new to this, there's only one crossing into Luhansk Oblast. It's like the province in American terms, and you can't walk. It's a rickety bridge, and many of the people who live out in these areas are old and can't move very well. They have mobility issues. Next time we do this event, we'll show that picture. Michael, tell us about the international community. So in 2014, when Putin first occupied and annexed Crimea, and then he invaded the Donbass, there was massive interest in the donor community. And we've seen those numbers plummet since then. What's going on now? Are people starting to open their wallets now that Putin's surrounding Ukraine by 3 sides?
Sure, well, I certainly hope so. But I just a quick note on the civilian infrastructure with the previous speaker brought up about, and yourself, about the rickety bridges. Excuse me, actually the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, part of their mandate is to facilitate repairs to civilian infrastructure like those crossings. They have been blocked and blocked and blocked on a daily basis by the combatants in Eastern Ukraine and the occupied areas. So that's something the Normandy format and everything could deal with, but it's really retarded repairs to water pipes and bridges and stuff like that. In terms of the donor community, well, look, for the longest time, we have to be frank about this. There's a lot of competition going on in terms of fundraising, especially with Afghanistan. The UN recently released an appeal, the biggest in its history for a single country, $5 billion. That fund has not been traditionally well funded, if I can put it that way. The Yemen appeal, which has caused horrendous human suffering, is only 60% funded. And then the UN appeal for Ukraine at $16 million only is just 40% funded. Now, I've worked on the donor side of UNICEF, and I know that Ukraine is basically seen as kind of a middle income country. So it's very difficult to fundraise for. But what we have to understand here is that should the scenario that we've been talking about take hold and happen, with massive migrants streaming out and other things, blockage of gas pipelines, this is quickly going to become, as I said last night, everybody's problem, including in the United States. We're going to see lack of gas in Europe, probably. We're going to see disruption to already strained supply chains, to food. Gas prices will go up. So it will be felt very, very quickly. Now, how can people help? Well, the diaspora, I know from talking to them, have been working very, very hard to pre-position and prepare for a crisis here. They're raising a lot of money. And that process is easier now than in 2014 because there's a lot more crowdfunding channels available to do that sort of thing. And also, I should say, and if I could politely challenge our panelist from the Verkhovna Rada, from the parliament, maybe when parliament opens up next week, his coalition or parties might propose something like a 1% emergency tax on the oligarchs who collectively control billions of dollars in Ukraine. Why do I say that? I say that because more and more in the diaspora, excuse me, I'm hearing, a bit of moaning about how much money is actually concentrated here in Ukraine, especially in the hands of the oligarchs. And I don't think this would be too crazy of a thing to propose, given how much money is concentrated there. And then the other thing that Ukraine could do for itself, actually, I always evangelize about how Ukraine has to show through its actions that it's a responsible member of the international community. The number of migrants or refugee claimants who are actually allowed into Ukraine is just a little trickle. And it has to open its borders and admit more vulnerable people from Syria, Afghanistan, and other places that would show that it's committed and that it's a two-way street. And finally, the other thing that people can do immediately, today, tomorrow, is UNICEF, which deals primarily with women and children, has national committees around the world, 35, I believe, right now, including UNICEF USA. If UNICEF USA doesn't have a separate fundraising appeal for Ukraine right now, you can put pressure on them to start one, and then they can start collecting money. And the other great thing about these so-called national committees, they have partnerships with a lot of big corporations, so they can actually collect donations in kind and also send them to places like Ukraine. Finally, put pressure on corporations making a lot of money here in Ukraine. Companies like Huawei are big here, and they could also step up to the plate and help vulnerable people.
Great. Those are some fabulous, practical, implementable steps. Thanks for that. Mr. Namiria, would you like to respond to Michael?
Yes, dear Michael, we tabled the question about the oligarchs. Basically, to make the long story short, there are two sources of strength for the oligarchs. One, they're monopolies. They're monopolists in the Ukrainian economy. And for that, the best instrument to deal with antitrust legislation. That's what we're supporting, and I think it should be not just put forward, but voted and approved. So this is the single most efficient step to de-oligarchization, as it's called in Ukraine. But second source of strength of the oligarchs is political proximity to the top decision makers. And I think what people are watching, to what extent the incumbent, the President Zelensky, who promised to distance himself from the oligarchs, to what extent he fulfilled this promise. And the people like Special K, Mr. Kolomoisky, to what extent he still keeps his proximity to President Zelensky, or it's not the case. So put an end to the political proximity of the oligarchs to top decision makers, and then to demonopolize Ukraine's economy through antitrust legislation. This is what we are calling for the long time, and ready to unite our efforts with whoever willing to, including President. If he would have a political will, we will support him.
Super, thank you. And Mr. Namiria, I hope you'll write up that argument on deregulation for our blog. I'd love to have us publish that. Michael, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, just quickly, I think the oligarchs as well could voluntarily do this, because no oligarch likes to be regulated. So the last time I checked, Mr. Poroshenko's bank account is not doing too badly. Maybe he could say, I'm putting $1 million down to an emergency humanitarian fund, have the oligarchs meet that pledge or double, triple it. That would be a very interesting initiative as well.
So,
Michael,
but then Mr. Poroshenko should stop to claim that he's a politician. He's either a billionaire, a businessman, or he's a politician.
Okay, let's get back to the conversation. Michael, I think you can throw this idea out in the ether. I think we'd love to publish that as well. It's a good challenge to the oligarchs. Mr. Namiria, how is Joe Biden doing so far in his response to the crisis in and around Ukraine? I'm not calling it the Ukraine crisis. I'm listening to you. Do you have, if you were going to brief him, what advice would you give to him now?
I believe Joe Biden is a veteran politician. I don't think he needs many advices. He has many instincts. And one of the things I want to admit that he strikes me as a politician that is learning some lessons. And I would like to remind, and at the end of this week, we will have a yet new Munich Security Conference. And it was Vice President at that time, Joe Biden, in his first major foreign policy speech in 2009 in Munich. He basically introduced this idea of reset with Russia, of Vladimir Putin and Medvedev. So it's failed. And I think lessons learned now that I believe President Biden does not have any illusion in terms of Putin's mind and Putin's ambitions. It's about autocracies versus democracies. So that's number one, learning lessons. Looks like he is learning these lessons. The second part of this learning lessons, that he was a part of the Obama administration that unfortunately refused systematically to provide Ukraine with a defensive lethal weapons. And now it's changed. So we have a proverb, better later than never. So, but what is needed, not just to keep the pace as it is now, also in close coordinations with such allies like the United Kingdom and some others, but to increase it, especially to fill the gaps in the areas I described already, as far as an anti-air defense and anti-ship defense, but also continue to provide very much needed training for the Ukrainian soldiers, because this is the brotherhood of military men that matters alone, not just as a sign of rhetorical solidarity, but solidarity in action. But it's also important, I believe, for President Biden to try to look at the experience of the other US president, Dwight Eisenhower, who I believe knew a thing or two about the military stalemates. So, and he said at once that you can solve, if you cannot solve a problem, try to enlarge it. So what does it mean in our context? The problem is not Donbass. Donbass is an instrument for Putin. There is no, as such, Putin's goal is not through Russian-Ukrainian war to satisfy his ambition. So his goal and his ambition is to rewrite the post-Cold War security order and use Ukraine as a hostage to achieve some concessions from the United States, from NATO, and to understand this, it's not enough. It is important to then follow in practice. What does it mean in practice? I think it's time and high time to admit that the so-called Minsk Accords, while probably was necessary to prevent the worst case scenario in 2014 and 15, but they proved to be definitely not sufficient to achieve a peaceful solution. The Normandy format, where there is Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France. There is no United States there. And this is something that sends a wrong signal to Putin that he could try to achieve his goal to end Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and to kill as many Ukrainians that he would need to achieve this goal, that the United States are leaders, and they could provide this leadership. So what I suggest to President Biden, to enlarge the problem, to move beyond considering the situation in Ukraine as just bilateral armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Stakes are much higher. So therefore, it could not and should not be addressed in the vacuum. It's a pan-European, pan-Euro-Atlantic problem, and should be addressed via both deterrence and dialogue, which is the banal thing to say. But what I also noticed, and this is a positive point as far as Biden administration, in the Russian Federation proposals of the draft treaties with the United States and with NATO, they shared in the middle of December of last year, there was not a single word about Budapest Memorandum. In the United States response, Budapest Memorandum was mentioned several times. I believe this is an important link which is missing now, that the situation in Ukraine is part of a larger problem that includes non-proliferation, that includes cyber, that includes transparency in military exercises, that include many other things. So that's where the diplomacy should show its role, but also the credible, timely support for strengthening Ukrainian army is a must.
Super. Thank you so much. Really important points. Okay, my friends, we have about 3 or 4 minutes for Blitz round. So I have questions from our audience. If you can go ahead and unmute yourself, all 4 of you. I'm going to ask you and direct a question at you. Give me a really short answer, the shortest you can do. Okay, ready? Dr. Nemiria, you get the first one. What is your view on Ukraine joining NATO? Are you pro, against, and why?
we are in favor of this, and the best formula to describe it, it's probably not now, but not never.
Okay, super. Got it. Is another question for you, Dr. Nemiria. Should Canada be in Normandy talks too, along with the U.S.? Do you want to see Germany and the U.K. too, or do you want a different format entirely?
Yeah, I believe it is important to have the United States in the format, because this is what Putin respects. He respects the United States and their determination to speak and to act seriously. He shows disrespect to Europe as such, including many European countries. There are 30 countries that express their interest. But also I believe there are room for such countries like Poland to play. We started our discussion today with the potential wave of migrants. Poland is immediate neighbor of Ukraine. There should be some, either within the OSCE format or some other format, role for such countries that are bordering Ukraine, including Slovakia, including Romania, and some others. So to show that Ukraine not just alone or neglected within the peripheral, not very efficient Normandy format, but where the United States sitting at the table, Ukraine sitting at the table, and those are willing to join, have an opportunity also to be part of it.
Super. Andrew Denary, if you can drop into the chat the Q&A, the 101 explainer on Minsk that Miroslava Gangadze wrote today. I think it's a really great, so the Minsk Accords are really important to understand. We've talked about them a lot today. They were the peace agreements that were signed in 2014, 2015, and they're very controversial because they were forced down Ukraine's throat. So if you could drop that in the chat, I think that'd be helpful to people who are new to this conversation. Maria, how many Crimean Tatar schools and Ukrainian language schools were there in Crimea before annexation, and how many are there now?
It's worth to say that there is not even a single school with Ukrainian language currently in Crimea, not even a single. There were not too many before the occupation, we have to confess it. It's related to the overall problem with policies within Crimea before the occupation started, but now you cannot go to Ukrainian school in Crimea. And when it comes to Crimean Tatar schools, like it's been said that you can attend 7 schools. I mean, there are 7 schools officially with Crimean Tatar language, but de facto, Crimean Tatar language is in these schools acts as an elective, so to say. So it's not true, basically, that you can. So it's like it's one of the main manifestations of the discrimination, I should say. And sorry, I have to say that because I think it's really important, because I think that it's important to say that in Ukraine, there is a unity and political unity as well around some core issues, like the territorial integrity, like issues related to Crimea in particular. And we have like this majority in the parliament, also in the parliament and in the society that do support the territorial integrity and the unity of Ukraine. I think it's important when we say about some political tensions within Ukraine.
Absolutely, absolutely. Everyone is united on that point. Good point, Maria. Okay, last question for Sasha. Sasha, this is a bit of a crazy question, and I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So if we do have the worst case scenario, and everyone prays and hopes that we don't have that, and we have 2 million or 3 million or 8 million Ukrainian refugees looking for some kind of safety, would some of those refugees potentially go to Belarus, or do you expect everyone to go to Poland, Romania, and Slovakia?
I think we can actually believe that, of course, some people would like to go to Belarus because people speak the same language, more or less those who know Russian. And likewise, in 2014, it was a lot of people who actually fled to Russia. And the Russian Federation dealt with this number. It's not just a. It was stated it was about 800,000 Ukrainians who had a special status there. So I think that it's possible, but of course Belarus is not so attractive as, for instance, Poland or Slovakia, economy-wise, just, and to some extent, Polish language is pretty, I mean, relatively close to Ukrainian, so people can learn quite easy. But I believe that it would not happen, and really just it's and people, of course, would stay at home.
Good. Let's hope and pray that that's the case. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. I was delighted to have Michael Basikaru, Alexander Galkin, Dr. Hohori Nemiria, and Maria Tomak as my guests today. Please watch our website. I've given you homework. You now have, two of you owe me blogs, so I'll be checking back on you guys. Please keep your eye on our future programming. Thank you for your time and attention. God bless Ukraine and God bless America. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Coming up, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan will join Press Secretary Jen